Patrick? We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I forgot to click unmute. What you missed was calling to order, approving the agenda, and electing Aaron Gibner as chair.
Oh, I thought we made Beth the chair.
Brad wanted. Right.
Brad's the vice chair.
Okay, it's your meeting.
All right. So the next chair is vice chair, the next officer, and I have someone in mind, but am open to collecting nominations. So does anyone have a nomination for vice chair?
I'll nominate Mike Dash.
Okay.
Second.
Any other nominations? Great, hearing none.
Good.
Mike, do you accept that nomination?
That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right.
Okay, all right, all those in favor of Mike Dash as vice chair, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, welcome to it, Mike.
Thanks.
Nice job, Mike.
Okay, moving on, our next officer to elect is for clerk. And I'll accept nominations for clerk.
I'd like to elect Liz Sayers.
Okay. Second,
I'll second that.
Kelly. Any other nominations? Okay, hearing none, Liz, you accept that nomination as clerk? Okay. All those in favor of Liz Sayre as your clerk? Aye, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Moving right on. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, our next agenda item is public comment. We do have a few publics. So just in general, for our public comment, we're really committed to creating space for our community members to share their thinking, worries, and any questions they have with the full board. And we do limit public comments to 2 minutes to help move our agenda along and to make sure everybody has a fair shot at saying what they would like to say. But we also have a duty to protect our students and our staff and our administration. So if there are any comments that step over some boundaries that allow us not to do that work, then we might either omit or revise or stop a comment. And I invite all of you as part of the board to also engage in that work of points of order if we need to. So with that, I'll just open the floor to public comment. Okay. I don't see any public comment. Okay. We'll move on to the board management and governance piece of our agenda. Okay, so first of all, I'm just really so glad you're here. Thanks for being dedicated and willing to put your time and energy into being a board member. It's a big deal. So I appreciate you guys being here. Normally at reorganization meetings, we'd have someone present or give a training about a piece of board work that we've been working on. For this particular reorganization meeting, I didn't have a really good grasp on what people were interested in knowing. And we have a lot of members that are fairly new, like a year old, and then some brand new members. So I was looking for this discussion, the first discussion item, to get a sense of what people might be interested in terms of training. With that said, I will spend some time with the newer board members to get them up to speed as far as what we do as a board, how we do our work. And I've put, actually, we put some resources at the very top of this agenda that people can go through, that go through some of that as well. So you can look at that at your leisure. It's got some good basics of policy and governance and how that looks when we're using it. And also for those new and old, if you are a new board member or relatively new board member and you're interested, the SBA has been putting out a series of new board member networking opportunities. Those are remote. You don't need to register for them. You just pop on. And there's one happening this week, Thursday, the 14th, and one on the 25th. So if you're interested, you can reach out to me and I can help you get set up with that. So with all that big ramble out of the way, does anyone have anything that they're particularly interested in terms of training, either resources we find or from VSBA that they think would be helpful going forward?
I have one sort of broad one, which
Okay.
is, I think I could use training on sort of kind of ways to be effective in our work across sort of the different levels of the board structure. So we have the whole meeting like this, and then we have our subcommittee meetings, and then we have sort of individual work. And to me, it's not always clear exactly how those intersect, right? How much I can do as an individual before I have to seek my committee's approval, or before I have to seek the board's approval, right? And how some of the work from the committee is actually like gets implemented and sort of best practices there. And so sort of thinking about how do we effectively use the structures that we've set up to actually get things done would be useful.
We may need to create those.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know, there are times I think in this last year where I sort of felt like I had a general sense of like what was supposed to be done. And
Yeah.
then, like running into how to do it. And maybe I'll even add one more on there, which is like interface with administration, right? Like, I don't know, sometimes like, am I allowed to just send an email to Jennifer and say, put this on the website? Like, can I do, like, if it was something that like, we had the budget video, like, we had sort of talked about it, we wanted that out there, but does that come from me as an individual? Does that come from me as a subcommittee chair? Does that come from the board as a whole? So trying not to overstep our bounds, but also feeling like the freedom to do something. And defining those borders, I think would be just useful.
What I think you're talking about, Mike, is what authority does an individual board member have versus a subcommittee versus the whole board?
And once we define that
Yeah.
authority, how do you kind of seamlessly move through that?
Yeah.
When the work gets done at the different levels,
Mhm.
essentially. But yes, I agree.
Okay.
Yeah. Mine would be communication. I feel like we have a lot of information. We have a lot of information for the general public. I'm not sure they're accessing it or know how to access it, and that was the feedback I got during and after the budget vote. So I feel like we need to work on how do we, I know we're putting together presentations, but how do we inform people about where the information is so they can get a better sense of what's going on?
Brad has this.
Yeah.
I didn't see that.
Brad?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Greetings from Budapest. It's kind of late here, so if I fade, please forgive me. But anyway, yeah, I mean, Barb just stole my thunder. I think that the biggest area where I've felt a lot of frustration from, my previous work with on the bond issue, and then with the district committee, and now with the MAUSD board, is that we're just not getting through to our constituents, even folks who otherwise might consider themselves, well informed. I've made comments about, I didn't know that. And so I'm just not sure where, it's been a constant battle, and at least on my part, a constant frustration. And so I just would second what Barb said. and anything we might be able to put together to figure out, what really are the best practices in communicating with, with our constituents, in these, in an educational setting, would be really helpful. The other comment I might make is, I think that the fact that we have, organized, sort of, committee structures is good, because it has allowed, again, speaking for myself, rather than try to know everything about everything, it's given me the opportunity to dig a little deeper into the specific issues confronted by, by the finance committee, which is not necessarily, in lieu of training, but it frees up time to learn more. And so I just make that comment. I think that's been very helpful.
Thanks, Brad. Anyone else in the room with any ideas about trainings we'd like to have? Yes, Steve.
I think it might be good, for the whole group to just go through where our information is. Walk through the school board website, our portion of the MAUSD website, walk through Google Drive. And just show people how it's organized and where things are. So that they have a sense of where to find things.
Yeah, that's a pretty easy one for internal. I could do that. Yeah, because that Google Drive is hard to navigate sometimes. Good job.
Yeah, I'm thinking, that we had some momentum with Krista on, not sure the right exact word to use for it. So I'm thinking about a little more broadly than just the conversation we had around, anti-racism, but an inclusion, or what it looks like best practice for, all the different levels of inclusion, like, accessibility of the building, accessibility of educational programming.
So are you thinking like a deep dive on what MAUSD is doing as far as that, or more globally a training from somewhere else that says, here's what best practices or what standards are?
Right, maybe that could be, maybe that's more of a retreat thing, maybe, right? And so we could learn about where we are, because we know we wanted to do that. And then maybe some best practice for future planning, because sometimes it's hard to imagine what that would, like, what would that ideally look like? Like, what would be the dream? What are we aiming for beyond where we are?
Erin, is there ever a time where we actually get a chance to tour through all of our different facilities? Because I would never think about going to Robinson, but yeah, we represent Robinson as well.
I have never done that. I'm not sure if that's ever, I know we have hosted meetings in other places before where there's been a small portion that we've toured the building, but are you more thinking during a school day or
Have to be
after,
during, I mean, like, we could do that certainly during
like a
a
board
retreat
before?
or something, but yeah.
Yeah, we used to rotate the monthly meetings through the buildings. And we'd have a tour. We always had a tour to start, like the 30 minutes prior to the start of the meeting. The technology, making the technology work the same way at every building became complicated. And frankly, the tours were usually very sparsely attended. So the effort put in to get students and principals there to give a tour to sometimes two people, it just sort of faded. And we decided we needed to really invest in a location to get the technology to work and all that. That being said, scheduling a tour and that being the purpose, that would be a fun, maybe that could be a committee night or something like that. We just do a tour.
I think COVID also put the bollocks on it.
Yeah, that did too. Yeah.
Right, like maybe we could,
Go ahead.
Maybe we could rotate our committee meetings to like have our school board meetings here, our business meetings, and then meet as committees at the different buildings.
Because we usually run them from a laptop anyway,
Yeah.
right?
Thank you.
Any other suggestions for trainings? Okay, I think that's a good place to start, gives us some things to look at. So I would suspect some of these will be embedded into future agendas. We'll just sort of plug along as we can with them. Okay. Next up on the agenda is an action item to review the committee structure. So can I get a motion to review committee structure?
So moved. Second.
To review committee structure.
I'm wondering, this one, because we don't have it defined, we wanted to be clear that there was potential action about what the committee structure would be, but we don't know what the recommendation is going to be for the committee structure. I'm wondering if this one, a little bit out of practice, but start with a discussion to see if we can define what's the direction the board wants to go in, which then may offer up a motion to actually take more specific action that folks can vote on. That makes sense?
We can accomplish it both ways. Once you have the action on the floor that's been moved and seconded, you can move right into the discussion from there.
I just know I don't know what the action would be.
But we'll find out.
Then we
You've got a
just have
plan,
to
right? Yeah.
amend the motion and then.
Or you can
approve that
withdraw,
after.
you can withdraw the motion. If you,
Did it? Yeah,
Withdraw.
I heard a motion, but I didn't hear one seconded, so I don't know that there's officially a motion on
I
the floor
second.
yet, right? You did second, okay.
I make a motion to withdraw. So we're withdrawing that motion so that we can move to a discussion instead.
Mhm.
Okay. So Kristen withdrew. Do we need to second that withdrawal?
I removed myself.
Okay,
So it's
do we need
clear, it's
to-
off the board.
I'll second it.
all in favor of that
No,
withdrawal?
you don't need it. She's withdrawing. It's-
No? Okay, we don't need to all approve that. We're good to go. Okay.
They just took it, yeah.
Let's discuss them. Okay, so over the last year, we've done some adjusting to get into that subcommittee structure. The committees meet the first standing meeting time of every month. And then our second meeting is the business meeting. And each committee runs their own meeting independently. We've been running them all out of here, mostly. So what we need to do at this point is to review the structure of the committees. Really to make sure that all of them are still feasible, that we're still all in agreement that the four that we have, facilities, finance, policy and governance, and community engagement are all still where we want to be. Because there's been some discussion about facilities and it being here. So I wanted to review, make sure that everyone's in agreement with that. And I'll just open the floor to discussion about how people feel about our communities as they are.
I know at our last meeting of the facilities committee, we thought that would probably be in the best interest if we combined with the finance committee. Because the workload is variable. And I think we all agreed that we would be more than willing to jump on the finance because you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, Kevin did the research
Yep.
that showed a lot of districts didn't have a separate committee. A lot of the finance and facilities were combined.
And you could have a subcommittee of the finance that focuses on facilities. If you needed to.
Okay,
You guys have conducted a couple joint meetings anyway, haven't you?
Yeah, I think as long as we kind of have that thought in mind that when like substantial facilities components come up, that we might partition that work off a little bit. that makes sense to me. I just felt as is, we were sort of behind in terms of our duty on the finance committee, like so consumed by the budget
Mhm.
that the thought of adding sort of additional broader responsibilities to that group, I worry a little bit about in terms of just how do we have like the time and the space to do all of that? But I recognize that on the other hand, there'll be more people there to help with the work, which is like really beneficial. So just thinking about how we can like manage to do that, right? Manage to be able to devote some attention to facilities when it really needs it. But still keep up with all the other things would be the only hesitation.
You know, like, facilities might have a pretty large project in front of them right now.
Coming slowly.
With the vote.
Yeah.
And finance is in the same boat. So,
Yeah, it seems like at least initially,
yeah,
there's plenty. As we have to come up with some sort of response to the vote in both cases.
right. But they also do affect each other directly. At the same time.
Brad,
Yeah, I guess, I guess I'd be interested to hear from members of the, Facilities Committee, whether they felt that over the course of the last, the last year, that they somehow were hamstrung or frustrated by not having, perhaps a broader mandate or having, more information in order to, conduct their deliberations and guide their thinking. I haven't, haven't been privy to any conversations with Kevin or anybody else on the committee, so I'd like to hear what they might have to say about that. I'd be a little bit worried about combining the facilities and the finance committees for a few reasons. One is that we've just undertaken to have a committee structure for 1 year. And there's something about sort of making this kind of a, fairly substantial adjustment to that structure so quickly with just 1 year under our belt. I'm not sure that's the best way to go. And then the second thing, my second point might be that, all of the committees are interrelated. What we do on the finance committee is, just as intertwined with the facilities committee as it is with the governance and the community outreach committee, or the communications committee. So, I don't know, so that would be, that's sort of a concern I have, that making a decision to fold the facilities committee into the finance committee because there is sort of, overlapping sort of interests and responsibilities. I'm just not sure that's the right way to go. And then the third point I might make is that one of the reasons, again, why we have the committee structure is to allow individual members of the board to do deeper dives into the 4 different areas. And I worry that if all of a sudden the deeper dive that I have to do on a facilities and a finance committee would be somewhat limited because of an added number of issues that would have to be taken under consideration. So I'm saying I'm not necessarily against it, but frankly, I'm personally a little skeptical that this might be a premature decision.
thanks, Brad.
How many members are on the finance committee right now?
There were 3, right?
So. I think it was Brad, Sarah, and Mike were the members of the committee.
And then Kylie sort of joined just right at the end there.
Okay.
This is a bit off topic, but how did we do election wise? Did we fill all the seats?
All but 2 in Bristol, but we'll get to that.
Okay. Is that on our agenda?
I'm gonna, Yes, sort of, not really. We'll get there.
I think that part of our frustration, Brad, you were asking how we felt. I think part of our frustration is from being from a three-person group rather than having more people to bounce off ideas or ideas off of. And when you're stuck with just three, and then we needed more information from the finance committee, or we needed, more information from the public engagement committee, it's always better to have more input when you're making big decisions like that than it is to just try and act on your own and then bring it to the board. And there's a lot of times in any three-person committee, you've only got two people. What happens if you end up with a tie? Then your work is delayed that much longer.
Or we didn't have a quorum.
Yeah.
A few times.
One of the other challenges the facilities committee talked through a couple of times this year was the challenge that there are policies that hold the superintendent accountable to facilities and their upkeep and what conditions they're in. Which puts that responsibility squarely on the superintendent. So to have a subcommittee that has a similar responsibility but can't be the same was a little bit tricky to kind of navigate. From an advisory standpoint, I think there was a lot of great back and forth and conversations and that deeper dive that you talked about, Brad, there was definitely value in that. But in terms of a charge and what authority that subcommittee had, it was a little bit less clear than the other subcommittees, I think. Like the board clearly has a responsibility over policy. Board clearly has a responsibility over budget. Board clearly has a responsibility over ownership linkage or community engagement. It's a little less clear on facilities for that reason. So that was part of the discussion about kind of folding that work into the finance as well.
Probably revealing some of my ignorance of policy governance, but is there the potential for like creation of ad hoc committees?
Mhm.
Right, in other words, if we didn't have a facilities committee, if it got folded into finance.
Yep.
But there was a clear project that needed a deep dive facilities wise, could we create a subcommittee of that?
That's
on-
what I said
on the fly?
originally.
Yep.
You could have a subcommittee of it.
Ad hoc or a work group is another term that's used
Yeah.
for sort of a peel off to really focus on a particular topic and bring that work back to a group that has some authority. Typically, those ad hocs or a work group doesn't have any authority. They're just sort of the
Researchers.
the workhorse of bringing the information forward to the body that has the authority to make the decision.
Yeah, and it seems like that, it feels like that was maybe what you felt was maybe the most valuable part was some of that deep dive that you bring to us, but it bring to us a board. Like that seems like a good structure, then you wouldn't be fully doing that. Not the facilities committee now, sorry,
Right,
like an ad hoc one
Right.
as needed.
right.
So that work still can get done, but it doesn't become your entire charge if you were appointed to that.
That's correct.
Yeah,
And then you have 6 people really on the finance committee.
To share that workload
Yeah.
as well.
It's the numbers that seem hard for me, like 3 people on finance committee seems fair to me.
Yeah, I think all the committee numbers were pretty thin. But with 4 committees and 13 board members, it's hard to have a big group in any of them.
Well, we're on the topic of group size, just so we're all clear, 6 would be the most that could be on any committee. Because 7 puts you at a quorum of the full board.
Right.
And we can talk about how many people can live on each committee, what makes sense. We don't have to stick with what we have now. We can adjust that.
I mean, if people want to serve on board.
Any other discussion about what we think about this committee structure as it is right now, or have we come to any agreement about what makes sense as far as facilities being its own? Yeah,
I think that makes sense. I did listen to Virgin's school board meeting last night. And they have up to 6 on all of them. I think they meet on different nights so that you can be a member of multiple committees
What an opportunity.
and totally overlap. But one thing that I was thinking of, it's not specifically committee the same way because it looks like it's kind of a slate of, like community council representative, that sort of thing. One thing that I felt, while we're pointing that I'd like us to consider is the overlap between our annual meeting and our town meeting was very small, right? Because I mean, we didn't have a lot of people, right? But there also, there wasn't even overlap. And then town meeting had some really great questions that were posed to the select board, and the select board also had really great questions. And I was wondering if we might consider having somebody from each town kind of be a liaison between the school board and the select board. So maybe you go twice a year to one of their meetings. They know you're coming. They can ask questions. We can bring them back here and then go back and answer their questions. And I just feel like there's a lot of fingers that go outside of, or not fingers, but like, there's just a lot of connections that the select board has outside of people that are involved with the schools. And I think it's really helpful for them to be really well informed. So, that I just thought that would be, something worth intentionally doing.
As a committee, you think, or as
I
part
think
of a committee's?
maybe, I mean, I was gonna bring it up, I think, our next community engagement committee meeting, but when I see here, it's very similar to a community council representative, so it feels kind of like it belongs on this list. Of something that we would do.
Erin, just to follow up on what Liz said. I mean, I think that's a good idea. I know that in Starksboro, it might be more of an issue in Bristol than it is in some of the other towns. Because I know that at least in Starksboro, I'm talking to the select board, at least once a month. It's not formal, but there's open lines of communication between select board members and at least myself, and I suspect maybe the same with Steve and Kristen. But I think it's a good idea.
So Liz, do you envision that do you want to start with a community engagement committee as looking at that? Or would you rather look at that as something we pick a group of people to do?
I mean, I guess, as a board, what do we think?
Yeah.
Because we definitely can have that be a topic of conversation. Or if people feel confident that one person per town can make that commitment, like Brad seems to already be, then we could do it here, but definitely happy to bring it to the committee, whatever you all want.
I think the ownership linkage plan pretty much, which we need to formally put out, but I think part of it reinforces the fact that everybody on the board is responsible for ownership linkage. So I think the community engagement committee could organize that, just put parameters around it. And give board members the, sort of a mini charge out of the community engagement committee to fulfill their duty to do ownership linkage.
And maybe like connect with the select boards, write an email to the
Or you
chair
gotta-
of every town and see what they would like, or how they might feel about it, or what they might want.
Right.
Something like that.
So do we need a motion to establish the board structure to look like community engagement, finance and facilities, policy and governance?
Yeah, so yes, that's one of the actions, yeah.
So I would make, and negotiations is separate. They don't have their own standing committee, right?
They do.
They do. Okay.
Yeah, that committee is actually required by statute. So we don't really have an option to form it or not form it.
So then I would make the motion that our committee structure would have a community engagement committee, a finance and facilities committee, policy and governance committee, and negotiations committee.
It would be best as well.
Yes, I would make the motion that our our committee structure would feature community engagement, finance and facilities, policy and governance, and negotiation.
Negotiations is separate.
Correct.
And I think finance and facility, you want to combine. You
That's what I
propose to
said.
combine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Any other discussion?
Do we want to add, putting the option to create a subcommittee or under finance for facilities into that? motion?
I
I
think
think that's
that committee,
inherent.
I think that committee could
Do
take
that
that
over.
upon themselves as needed. I think that was my point.
I think we could put that,
Ad hoc.
put that in the charge, right?
Well, I think
Define
it's,
it there.
I think it's
It's an existing authority. I don't think.
it's an existing
Yeah.
authority. You don't necessarily, any subcommittee can create a subcommittee of a subcommittee.
Okay.
You just have to mind the quorum situation. The challenge with a subcommittee of 3 that creates a committee that has any authority of 2, you now have a quorum of that subcommittee. So that gets a little bit tricky sometimes. We're talking about a group of 6. You can have 2 or 3 people work on something and you don't have a quorum.
So the community engagement committee would have 6 or 3. 3 members?
I think the benefit is we'd have 13 members to divide 3 ways instead of 4, so each committee theoretically could have more than they might now, up to 6.
Okay.
That language that you mentioned for Jen's uses is a good example.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's going to be the opportunity to combine 2 of these, I think those are the 2 likely candidates. And that would help populate the other committees.
And even if you wanted to keep meetings happening the same night, which is more or less how it has worked in this past year, each committee could have 4 or 5 members. If you wanted to move to different nights, then each committee could have 6 theoretically, but people would be on
No,
multiple
no,
committees.
no.
As good as it's.
Yeah. But 4 or 5 is pretty good.
Yeah,
So,
those and 3.
Currently, policy and governance has 2.
Yeah.
So,
So if we're, any other discussion in that motion? Okay, so all of those in favor of creating community engagement committee, finance and facilities, policy and governance and negotiations as our subcommittees, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any
I
abstentions?
I can't really decide, so I think I'll abstain. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Brad. Okay. The next action item is to revise our committee charges. Are we running into the same issue where we don't really know what we're doing yet? So maybe keep it a discussion first and then create our action point from there. That feel okay? Okay.
And you could, if it gets to the point of wordsmithing, this could perhaps even be a homework assignment to the now formed. So facilities and finance is the one that obviously needs a little bit of work because that's kind of a new concept. Maybe the others need tweaking as well, but that one for sure needs something, so that rather than wordsmith it here together with a dozen people or so, sending that committee off to do that work and bring back a charge for the board to act on is an option.
I think that's actually how we handled it last
It
year.
is, yeah.
Yeah, because I kind of feel, and we've chatted about, the community engagement committee. It seems like it kind of diverts from what we should be focusing on. So I think as a committee, I think we kind of need to figure out what that is, and then perhaps we come back to the board to say, here's, this is what we've landed on, and then we can perhaps adopt it from there, if that makes sense.
Okay. So do we want to table this action item?
I
Or
think you
withdraw?
could make a motion to. Well, it's. Okay, so we have the committee structures.
Yep.
So I think we can make a motion to ask the committees to. Bring back any revisions to their charges to. The full board at our next meeting.
So it'd actually be our next,
The April meeting.
the April meeting, April business meeting,
Okay,
because we wouldn't have had our committee meetings yet
right.
before our business meeting.
I second your motion.
You're seconding?
Yeah.
Kathy second.
Any other discussion about that motion?
So I have to ask the committees to review the charges and bring it back to the board. Yeah. Sorry, you said.
Can you read what you have?
Ask the committee to review the charges and bring back.
Bring back any revisions,
Bring back.
any proposed revisions to the board for action. 'Cause the board has to actually. The board is in charge of the charges.
And you want to say at the April meeting?
At our next business meeting.
Yep. Next business meeting. Mhm.
April business
April
meeting. The
business
next
meeting,
business
yeah.
meeting is March 26th.
April business.
So there's no committee meetings between now and March 26th.
Okay.
Right.
I see.
Unless folks wanted to add another meeting.
No, that's
No,
fine.
Great.
Everyone's so eager. Any other discussion about this motion? Okay. All those in favor for individual committees to bring back their amended charges for the April business meeting? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Now, our next action item is to appoint representatives to those committees. So we could either have people say which one they want, and we can just do a full slate motion, or we could do it individually. People like the full slate option. Okay. All right, can I have a motion to appoint representatives? Do we need to discuss it first?
Well, it's kind of, this is another.
Yeah, another one where it's backwards.
I
Okay,
think we may want to have a discussion first.
and then
Just
do the
let people
motion.
voice their opinions about it,
Okay,
and then once we finalize where people want to settle, then we can make a motion.
okay. Okay. So, where do you want to live?
So I'm easy, policy and governance,
Mhm.
already way knee deep in it. The question, I think, Aaron, is whether you want to continue
Yeah,
dual role now.
For citizenship.
But I'm happy to continue pushing that boat down the road.
so I'm actually gonna jump ship, Steve, unfortunately, to go to community engagement
Okay,
as a favor. So I'm actually gonna move over there to do that work with that committee.
okay,
But I will say policy and governance for those who are newer to the board is great, because you get a really good look at what we actually do, where all those policies live, what they mean, how we use them. I learned a lot, and Steve is a wealth of knowledge.
Agreed. he
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. So you should think about that.
and it's also, working on tools for how the board does monitoring reports, how we evaluate the superintendent. I'm just trying to clean up and organize our toolbox.
Thank you.
That's great. Anyone else have a really strong opinion about where you want to be? Yeah, Barb?
I'd like to remain on community engagement.
Okay.
I'd like to be on the finance committee.
I'd like to stay on finance.
I'd also like to stay on the community engagement committee, please.
I'm sorry, who was that?
Kristen?
I was thinking I would stay with the facilities. But, hearing your explanation about the governance policy, I'd like to jump over there with you, Steve.
All right.
Trying to
Thanks,
gain a
Justin.
wealth of knowledge here.
Yeah.
You helped me pretty well with the monitoring report. I still
It's a learned skill. I'd like finance and facilities, please.
I'm just kind of waiting to see how things,
says.
yeah.
I will say that for negotiations, both Barb and I are currently who's in negotiations. I think it makes sense for us to stay and finish that process. If no one's,
And worth noting, so support staff are currently negotiating.
Yeah.
And that will hopefully sunset this spring sometime. And because this is until next March, in the fall of next year, professional staff will begin negotiations. So it probably makes sense. Maybe today, maybe in the future, but we could appoint folks beyond Aaron and Barb, knowing that they'll continue the support staff negotiations, and the additional names that get added would work with the professional staff negotiations.
Liz, have you ever done one negotiation?
I have not.
Oh,
I have not, but I do think I find it intimidating is why.
yeah, well, it is. It's,
So, but
interesting.
I do think that it's, I mean, Krista, you know, I certainly think that, I know we got 2 for support staff, but at one point, when the board was first formed, we had 3 for each set of negotiations committees, and that feels a little better to me. So I will join a negotiations committee. But I am definitely feeling like that there needs to be support, and anyone that has experience whatsoever with that would be amazing. And certainly I know we're supported by administration, but that's, and I know there's training, but, yeah, so I think the more of us that can get involved there, it's probably a really good thing.
It is a lot of work, and I think with a number of folks that wouldn't have gone through this yet, the process we use for negotiations is called critical issues bargaining. It is not what I would say most school districts use, which is very traditional bargaining, where it's mostly lawyers talking to lawyers and people sitting and listening to that conversation, and then you caucus here and caucus there and come back and the lawyers talk again. Like, that's not how this works. There are no lawyers involved. Haven't been in the 8 years that I've been here. There's always that potential, if you can't kind of get to a place where you're in agreement, that it goes the traditional route and lawyers get involved. We just haven't had that. So it's a handful of folks from the union, and ideally a handful of folks from the board, with a federal mediator who kind of facilitates the process and makes sure that we adhere to the ground rules and things like that. It's a much, much, much more collaborative endeavor than the traditional bargaining. Still a lot of work, can still be intimidating because we cover a lot of ground and we go way deep into some things. But it's not the very confrontational kind of approach that you might imagine if you've had experience doing it elsewhere.
Yeah, so I'm fine with participating in the fall. currently doing that for the career center now. But that should be done before the end of the fiscal year. Um,
Thanks, Dave.
and yes,
Thanks, Liz.
they are using the traditional approach, and I highly recommend the one that we're using instead.
Does our approach bring closure faster?
I don't know if it's necessarily faster, you just, both parties are less aggravated at each other potentially by the time you're done. It's more team building, I think. It feels like more of a team building
More
exercise.
collaborative?
Yeah,
Yeah, there's a collective deeper understanding of the issues.
the whole group gets to discuss. And anybody can, in the group can basically a thumbs down to a proposal. It's not just, the 2 point people of the teams sort of throwing things back and forth at each other. Everybody gets to discuss. There's a little bit more problem solving, more brainstorming kind of things going on. So you feel like it's more of a group effort.
And Katrina and I are support people. We don't get thumbs in that process. But we bring the depth of understanding of sort of the implementation of the contract and the language. So we talk about how this could be operationalized and the pros and cons of wherever the conversation might be going. And we obviously tap into Floyd and HR, so we bring the resources to the table to have a conversation to make informed decisions.
And their level of participation in the process is much higher than in the traditional process.
As soon as I retire from my real job, I'll
Yeah,
join you.
What's the commitment typically for that committee?
it can be every 2 weeks for several
3
months.
Mhm.
It's about
And it's-
3-hour meetings.
Yeah, 5 to 8-ish, every couple of weeks
Yeah,
for,
we're doing 6 to 8 right now. Which doesn't make a lot of progress happen. But more bearable.
yeah. There's usually food.
It's good food, yeah.
It's really good food.
Think about it, if other people decide that they are interested for the professional staff, we don't have to be totally hard and fast about
Yeah.
that committee tonight, but
More than 2 would be good.
More
though.
than
Yeah,
two would
There's a lot of
we have to have
pressure.
three
Yeah,
people
2 is a
there
lot of
because there's usually a pretty large union contingent.
Probably 5 or 6 union folks. And it's not, and again, the process isn't about show of force in numbers,
No,
but it does. Fewer board members puts more weight on the shoulders of those board members, I think is a fair statement.
There's a decent chance I could do this year. It's a good year for me.
Starting in the fall.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
medical coming up, so my schedule is much more
a
flexible. than-
TTA, yeah.
Yeah, so.
I think I heard it might commit.
Yeah, it's a
Is that how it
light,
is?
it's a light. But if when you're a third, there's a decent chance I could do that.
Okay. I'll just put a question mark next to you, but we'll,
That sounds fine.
yeah. So right now for community engagement, we have 3 members, finance and facility, 3 members. Policy and governance, 2. And our negotiation team is remaining the same. So people I don't have yet, Ashley, Liz, I'm assuming you want community engagement, so I'm gonna put you there.
Yep.
So Ashley and Mike,
So community engagement now has 4.
community engagement.
Unless, a new member wanted to.
Yeah.
I can go anywhere, but also I imagine that when negotiations committee people get busy, that maybe they take. Like, I pretty much take minutes for community engagement, like that's kind of. I don't know if that makes sense. That might not make sense, but if you're really busy with the negotiations, like I hope that your workload is a little lighter and your expectations for your regular committee perhaps.
Yeah.
Did
We
you?
usually meet on Wednesdays for negotiations,
Okay.
so it doesn't overlap too much.
Cause I can't see Mike doing our superintendent, being our co-chair, doing our superintendent, like doing the budget presentations and doing negotiations all at the same time. Like, so as long as there's a shifting of responsibility. for
I
him.
think that's fair.
But the
Hopefully
food is
you
really
feel
good.
It's really good.
Aaron, I'm fine wherever. I'm certainly happy to stay in finance.
Okay.
But if it feels like policy is light, I can move, but I don't have any real desire to, I suppose. I'm fine either way.
I'd prefer to sit on policy over finance.
Okay. Okay,
That makes it easy.
that works out, yeah.
Yeah.
And then when we get our next two, our two empty Bristol seats filled, then we have a good balance right now. Policy and governance has 3, finance facility 4, and community engagement has 4. So we have some good leeway, I think, for that.
And with this new structure, if we did need to do like a facilities ad hoc, it could have 2 people coming out of the group before, that'll be fine.
Yep, because you're not a quorum.
Okay. That seems reasonable.
Did we also want to talk about the board rep to the career center in this?
How do we usually, do we nominate this person or do we vote on sending Kim or,
So right now we're talking about the board rep.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yep. Which has been Steve for a number of years.
These are all nominated seats. Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
technically the chair has the authority to appoint members to fill
There-
committees, but I think the practice for this board has been as a board to agree, sort of approve the slate, if you will.
Are you willing to stay on? Steve?
I have to anyway. July 1st.
This is part of the negotiations.
Ah.
Be really hard if your negotiators for the board all just.
Running negotiations.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
yeah, it really challenges.
Everyone feel good about Steve staying on?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. And then, for the community rep, Kim Farnham has done that for a number of years and she's expressed that she would like to continue with that role.
She's currently the board chair.
I nominate Kim Farnham.
Can you say the name, please?
Kim
Kim-
Farnham, she's on the agenda.
FARN.
Yeah.
HAN,
She's already on the agenda.
FARNHAN.
You want to feel good about that? Okay, and then the last one is a community council rep. I think Krista was Krista doing it? Or were you,
This has been as well.
you've done it?
Yeah, I was also trying to do that. It's just they meet after school now. They were meeting, and I just can't, I mean, I just. There's just no way for me to be there during that time that they're running. So I don't know if anyone else is available, you can even zoom in. So they have a Zoom link, so it's Mondays, right now they're meeting right after school on Mondays. I mean, I can do that, and just, but there's just no way that I would be at all of them. It would kind of be more like what I was thinking with select boards, like kind of check in, see how they're doing, make sure that we know they care. Or that we know, they know we care. And that we know that they care about what we're doing, right? And I think really Isabel Shea has been doing the majority of the work of communicating to them. Because anytime she comes to our meetings, she does go back to them and she tells them what we've been talking about. So she's taken a lot of that.
That's great. Isabel is our student rep that comes to our board meetings. Well, does anyone have a particular, I know that you're maybe a little bit stretched, but does anyone else feel like that's interesting to them and would want to do that, or are we okay with how Liz has committed to fulfilling that?
Can somebody speak to what the community council representative is?
Absolutely. So it's a really great group. They are all the way from 7 through 12. And they include community members, they include teachers and staff, and as many kids as they can get from the school. And it's just this great group. They talk about, somebody will write them a proposal. There's some in the hallway. And they talk about, one thing they added last year when I was able to attend was, I think it was, Asian Pacific Islander Day to celebrate at school. So a kid brought that proposal forward and then they talked about it. They did some great work around the national anthem and the Black Lives Matter flag, right? And like approving for it to go up and then approving for it to remain up. And there was a bunch of community engagement there. So it's a really great group.
And it's only this school,
Oh,
just.
it's in Bristol, but it's, what is that, what did you say? Sorry.
It's just.
Just
not
not
a-
Just mounting.
Yeah, it's just Mount Abe, but then it's all, they have, if they could get them, they would be looking for people from all 4 towns.
I mean, in terms of the student.
In terms of the student, it's right over there in that room on the corner after school for just like 25 minutes. A lot of times they get together and they wanted to, I mean, one time, not a lot of times, but one day they talked about the logo that they wanted for their gear, right? So it's not an intense thing and it's fun. And I think it could be accomplished being a representative without being at all of the meetings. It's just that in order to be a voting member, you would need to attend often. But I think that they love to have their principal there. They love to have anyone there hearing them and being interested in what they're doing, which is great work.
So I wonder if we took turns.
I
I
was
was
thinking the same thing. Yeah,
I couldn't commit to everyone, but I could attend 1 or 2. Awesome,
I could zoom in.
right? Zoom in.
Maybe. Somebody wants to set up a sign-up sheet.
I do wonder, and Liz, you'd know better than I, there is something lost with no continuity of a board member that's been, because sometimes topics will span multiple sessions. So if you pop into the middle session, your value add to that conversation is less than if you've been part of that conversation from start to finish. So
I
it can
agree.
happen the other way, but I just
If
want to
you're
point
gonna be
that
a
out,
voting member for sure. yeah.
right?
I definitely agree, but I think the staff here from the building that goes in and participates, they really fill that role. I find myself speaking as little as possible,
Mhm.
frankly, so that they can like just have that. But certainly, I think if we were popping in and became interested in something they were addressing, we could continuing to go and maybe saying, hey, I want to do another month because I'm feeling engaged in this topic, so maybe leaving it flexible.
Do they have minutes for their
They
meeting?
do, they have a minute taker, they have a communicator, they're like really.
There's a chair, I don't know if they use the term chair, but they have a facilitator at least, yeah.
Yeah, and they have an executive committee that meets after each meeting
Mhm.
and plans the agenda, so it's.
So it's enough, if you want to share, then you can also just look at the minutes from
That's
the
true,
meeting before.
right? Yep.
It would be worth, if if the board's interest was the pop in, it probably would be worth talking with the council to see like,
Are they interested?
does that work? Cause that hasn't been the model that's been
Yeah,
used.
It's not them decide. how to
Yeah.
feel about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll do that. I'll commit to doing that and going in and seeing what they think.
Okay.
Cool.
And you'll bring that
Thankfully.
back to us.
Great.
Okay. All right, that's all of the places we need to put people. So how do we want to put this out as an action item?
I think somebody could move the slate that we just discussed.
Is Vicky clear on it?
Yes, I have all the names, but what I'm. So I have, I said, put everybody in. So it's just listed differently on the agenda than you proceeded, that's why. I'm
Right.
Struggling tonight.
Yes,
Same
we
thing
changed things.
earlier,
Yeah.
there was no motion second, but you were. So we are, so we need a motion.
I'll make a motion to appoint representatives as discussed to Community Engagement Committee, Finance and Facilities Committee, Policy and Governance Committee negotiations, board rep to PAHCC, community rep to PHACC, and the community council representative.
Second,
I'm sorry, you say to appoint representatives to the board committees as follows, and then I list everybody.
Yes,
on the
that'll work, yeah.
Okay. Is that all right with you, Kathy, since you said
Yes.
so?
yeah, thank you.
Any other discussion? All those in favor of appointing the representatives to the following committees as discussed, say aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. The next action item is to fill the board highlights assignment. So can I have a motion to fill board highlights assignment, please?
So moved.
Justin?
Second,
Justin? All right. Discussion about filling the highlights assessment assignment, so this has been a place where we've sort of struggled to do continually. We've had some people do it and some people not do it, and so it's been inconsistent in practice. So we can either continue and just dedicate that we're all going to do it as we're assigned, or I'm open to suggestions about how we improve it, or do we continue with it? Yeah, Steve.
So I'm not seeing a link,
Yeah, there was,
Yeah.
there wasn't a link to that.
and people who are not familiar with it probably need a little.
Yeah.
FYI on what it is. So essentially is our attempt to increase the bandwidth of our, instead of just relying on the meeting minutes going to being posted on the website. A board member was sort of responsible for condensing the highlights of the meeting, some of the key points that happened in the meeting. And creating a little blurb that could go out to Front Porch Forum, Facebook, wherever else we're posting to social media. Just to again, sort of put what we're up to out there in front of people more often and in more accessible fashion. Just relying on our meeting minutes.
So traditionally, would that be the role of the board clerk? to do it?
It's traditionally been assigned to folks based on a spreadsheet that we were keeping.
I just pulled it up if folks want to know when they've done it, but
I don't think I have done it yet.
Yeah, I think I might have missed my turn.
Yeah, I definitely was not on.
Thus the inconsistency issue.
Yeah.
Liz?
Yeah, I could do my best. And
I want to add one more thing,
But
I'm just
it's-
clarifying, right?
the only reason that we got to that point in the conversation about taking turns on it was because we were, and I suspect we will be again in some really tricky conversations. And we have very different perspectives as board members, so it was actually a balancing mechanism to have different people write the highlights. Because I mean, you would think that they would look the same, but we would express the highlights differently from each meeting as individuals. So that was kind of a way of balancing the communication, was by having everybody essentially take a turn on their perception. They're writing the highlights for this meeting because we didn't know, well, should it bounce to the chair and then have the chair look at it? Should we all be able to give input on the highlights? And then should we, so it kind of got just a little simpler to just say, everybody just gets an opportunity to do the highlights for a month, and we'll all send them out. I think you certainly do send them to the chair, and the chair does look over them before they go out, but they're kind of yeah. I think we're gonna, but we know that happened at time, and it happens, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Brad?
What about having this, function be part of the, outreach community engagement committee? Have them do it.
Now that the appointments have been made.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. That would be a logical function, I think.
So this gets back to Mike's earlier point about. So if somebody, say if I do a synopsis of the meeting, I just go ahead and post it, or where would it go from me to have
Yeah,
it?
so there was a
I mean,
cross,
I would be really uncomfortable doing it.
there was a
to be honest with you.
cross-check method where it went back to the board chair and vice chair for a read.
It seems like a lot of work for a few bullets.
Well, she was to avoid somebody,
Yeah.
I mean, everybody needs to have an editor look at something anyway,
Right,
you know,
right.
so. Just for mistakes, or you forgot something, or you thought you heard something that wasn't actually the way it happened,
Mhm.
and being able to bounce it off of two other people.
Then the request would come from the chair out to say, can you please post on Front Porch Forum in your
Right.
town?
Right. Right, chair would,
And I was never sure where that came from, so I'm not gonna post what I don't know where it came. So do these come out, I'm sorry, I don't mean to monopolize. Do these come out after the minutes are approved and posted on our website?
it was sort of spy in terms of when it came in.
I don't think it necessarily was waiting for the minutes.
No.
It was whenever the person that was in charge of it that week or that time drafted it, and it went through the process of being checked and then got distributed.
So it's in advance of the board approving the minutes of what was recorded for that meeting.
It can be.
Potentially.
I see sort of a legal problem there. If you're releasing information about a board meeting from a board member that we have not approved those minutes for posting.
It's a valid point.
So we could add them to our agenda as we have a lot of hyperlinks up at the top of the agenda. We could always have previous board or previous highlights or something to that effect embedded in the next agenda.
The challenge of that process that you just described, Kathy, would be you would be posting the board highlights from 2 meetings ago, following the meeting where the
Right.
minutes got approved. So I think that will be a
That's-
confusing message probably to the community.
That's the rub, is that we're trying to be a little more,
Upfront.
well, give people more access to it, other than just relying on the minutes.
Mhm.
But you want to be timely with that
Right.
exercise as well.
And just so we all know, the draft minutes have to be posted by law within 5 days of the meeting. So the information as they sit leaving this meeting before approval is already out in, available to the community on the
So if
website.
they're available already, aren't we duplicating our efforts then? I think I'm wanting to work smarter, not harder here. And if they're already out, can't we just say the link to the draft minutes is here?
It really.
I think it should be in every board highway anyway. I think what it's doing though, if you read them, is that they're not written in minute speak. It's a little more conversational, it's a little more, I think, digestible to like the lay person. They may not be, familiar with some of, the way this is organized and emotions and everything.
Has there ever been a situation, and maybe that's where the editing comes in, a situation where information that shouldn't be released is released through a board highlight?
I don't
Not that I'm
think so.
aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think people aren't really diving that deeply in on the highlights. I think it's more like we covered this topic this month. And I think most people do put in, yes, go to the website for more information. It's really to tickle people's interest in something, like, oh, wow, they talked about school choice this month. What did they say? Well, you don't necessarily have to dive into everything that was said about it. But you can say, we talked about it, there was some good discussion, if you want more information, go see this.
And
So
then
not
the-
really,
the highlight doesn't stray from the conversation that happened at the board table, which is recorded. And so it's effectively, information is released in real time anyway, so The only place it would be a problem is if somebody either strayed from what was discussed at the board table, or injected their own thinking and as though it represented the board's thinking, which we haven't run into an issue, but those are the potential risks. But in terms of releasing something prematurely, it's right there as it is right now. So there isn't a risk necessarily in that regard.
Liz, you've had your hand up a couple times.
Yeah, it's just an opportunity, a matter of sentences, as much as doing minutes as highlights would be awesome to just shorten them up like that. Its highlights are just like a few things of, yeah, like you said, we talked about choice to kind of like, hey, this is something that's going on. At the time we were doing the community engagement events, so this event happened, to really just kind of make us accessible is the feeling. So very light on information and opinions, and just very kind of just an invitation to get involved if there's a big topic that a person might feel passionate about and want to come.
Is it as simple as something that we could just discuss at the end of every board meeting? Like, what do we want to highlight from this meeting that we want the community to know we talked about?
I think we've actually taken that approach a couple of times.
Good.
We do the survey at the end of the meeting.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of
And,
remembering.
I know when we started this process, we actually identified the person who was doing the highlights and actually discussed what we wanted on the highlights.
In broad strokes, so they knew
Broad
kind of what to go
strokes,
and
yeah.
flesh out a little bit.
Right.
Like having a format that you can kind of plug and play.
I'm trying to think,
Could
so
look like
we have
that,
our
but-
business meeting. And then 2 weeks later, the community engagement ready meets, right? Trying to think.
Well, in the highlights, in the assessment for our board work, there's a place that says what went well with the meeting. And I think that would be a really opportune place for people to say what went well with the meeting, and then whoever's responsible for highlights just uses that sort of, this is what went well idea to format their board highlights. It's a pretty simple way to just gather the information you need for the highlights. And that we do every time.
Hey, Aaron.
Yes, Brad?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that the confusion over this issue, as well as the, kind of the very mixed implementation over the last couple of years, kind of speaks for itself. Maybe I was being a little bit, glib, saying have the community engagement committee just take over, but maybe it should. A recommendation should be made by the community engagement committee about how this ought to happen, and how it ought to be sort of coordinated with other outreach efforts. So there's a little bit of, I don't know, continuity, a little bit of sort of thought given to it, because it seems to me, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the way we've done it over the last couple of years hasn't really been that effective. That's just a suggestion.
That made thinking, Brad, sort of to your point earlier, Steve, maybe how does this get folded into the community link, the ownership linkage plan? That's effectively what it is. It's a tool to engage that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think shifting the responsibility around the table, I think, is a good practice. It makes at the Career Center, the way we do the survey at the end of the meeting is that board members take turns. Like Aaron, you would simply pick somebody at the end of the meeting and say, you give us your feedback on the meeting tonight.
Okay.
And it could be that if there was a slate already set up, that person, one, would know they needed to take some good notes at that meeting. They need to attend the meeting, for starters, which they would need to pay attention for potential topics. And then they would be And we could potentially even call on them to give their impression of what happened at the meeting. And that could be a rotating thing, so everybody gets a chance to do it.
Sort of like monitoring reports.
It's sort of, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And there's 12, 13 of us,
13 would pull.
so if we
So it's one
excuse
month?
you, it'd be 1 a month. Because you're looking at each highlight every month.
Right.
Even that
Right.
could excuse too. There's only 11 months that we have meetings
Right.
typically, so. July's off. You get July off. Great.
I'll take
I'll take
July.
So we're shifting a little bit then, are thinking about the board highlight
Maybe that-
assessment process.
Yeah, maybe the community engagement committee considers the discussions we've had. about this. Comes up with
Okay.
Some recommendations.
Are we also interested in looking at embedding a different practice for how we're doing the board survey at the end of the meeting? And having that be a place to also have more linkage from each individual person?
That's on the policy and governance agenda right now.
Okay.
To look at that self-evaluation. There's also the SBA board self-evaluation assessment tool that we're starting to look at, and we may break out. That's something that might just be a retreat exercise.
Okay.
It should happen at a point in time where the board has enough experience under its belt as a group to make that happen. Like, I would say, to me, the most advantageous time to have done a full board self-assessment was our last meeting. Because that's when everybody's had a year's worth of tenure. We're not asking new board members to give their opinion of something they haven't even experienced yet.
Yeah.
So. But yeah, we were gonna look at, because there's two of these tools that show up on this agenda. I think Don had started working on another one, and this was something we were gonna play around with, see if we could make something a little more coherent.
And I think it's worth acknowledging just for a minute, the fact that we're talking about refining the board reflection tool is great, because wasn't that long ago, there wasn't a reflection. So this practice, it really has become a practice that is now being refined, and that's
Yeah.
something to be celebrated.
So it sounds like we might need to amend the motion that we had. Who made the original motion? To fill the, sorry, Kristen? We'll walk through it together.
Yes, please.
Okay, so the original motion was to fill the board highlights assignment. It sounds like we're shifting the motion to now be that we're going to ask the Community Engagement Committee to discuss that.
Simplest thing might be to just vote down that motion,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
make a new motion, you report with that.
Or we're gonna give everybody a shot at it. We can
Right.
just go ahead and fill it, and then community engagement maybe could just give us more feedback about how it's done.
How do people feel about that?
Yeah, and how you dovetail, you know. Did we lose you, Brad?
No, he's there.
Maybe even add small details like, here's the date that you're responsible. If you have a conflict, it's your responsibility to reach out to somebody else to switch, just to make sure that there's coverage. But again, to Kylie's point, if it's once, if you just have to do it once a year, it shouldn't be rocket surgery to reassign or switch or whatever.
I noticed at the very bottom of the agenda, we note like who has a monitoring report due. We could also
Put it down there.
put who the next We're supposed to do the next highlight.
Mhm.
So in the past, have we offered for people to volunteer for a slot, or have we just put them in and
Kristen
One per
just,
month.
I thought Kristen
we
just
just plug and play?
put people in
Okay,
the schedule, and then if you had a problem,
Yeah.
you could,
switch. Okay,
you know, say, hey, I can't do X, Y, or Z, and then other folks could swap with you or whatever.
Yep.
okay. So are people comfortable if I just make tentative and then you guys can, we'll add it to the bottom of the agenda so you know when your turn is and then,
Well, if you put the link at the top.
Yeah.
Like I think it was up there. at one
it
point,
was, yeah, I think we
that you
removed
can
it for
check, you
this,
can check the whole sheet.
right?
You can go look at the whole assignment.
Not sure what it is. I might suggest for community engagement to think about how that then gets disseminated. Like if there's a better way, because
Mhm.
I feel like sending blindly to the board that says like, please post this to the 4 towns, like
Yeah.
sometimes works and sometimes doesn't.
Yeah.
So if we had like a very clear way to do that, I think it would make this like way more palatable.
Mhm.
I don't know what that is. I was just trying to like quickly look to see if there was like a more global account like the district has in terms of being able to post on Front Porch Forum.
Right,
I don't really actually know what those options are, but
right.
We're
and-
limited as a district to a certain number of postings every month, but if you spread it out amongst the representatives, then it doesn't really matter.
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
But then it like we're sometimes struggling to efficiently get that information out, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the other challenges with the district post is that just the structure of it, it comes out as though it's from me,
Right.
as
Yeah.
opposed to from the board. And there's not really a great workaround. for
Yeah, I
that.
guess what I was saying is like, is there a comparable thing that we as a board could have?
Oh, right.
Right, I mean, the district has its own thing, that's great, but if the board could establish, like, this is our way of posting it from, and I don't know what those options are.
Is it
We
gonna
can
cost
look into
money?
that and see.
You have to buy-
We could look at
It
that.
does actually, yeah,
We have
it's,
to buy a membership.
Sure.
it's $1,000 or $2,000, I think, is what we
That's
have to
probably what
pay.
we want to do.
Right.
But it
For
just seems
free
like if
service,
it's,
yeah.
if it's feeding through our chair anyways.
Right.
We already have centralization of the report,
Mhm.
like, it would be nice if it just could go out, but maybe that's a dream. that
I'm happy to
doesn't
look
exist.
into that and just see what options exist and then I guess share it with the community engagement committee chair when that
Yeah.
person's identified. Is that,
I think that would just help.
The
And
only-
maybe it is like we just found it.
So-
Yeah,
Aaron.
I mean, as long as we
We're-
understand who from each town is actually doing it,
We're
because
retarded.
obviously you don't want everybody, Bristol is swamped to these things. But I think people appreciate getting something from their local rep
Mhm.
in Front Porch Forum.
I think the other place too, we're thinking about is, once it's decided how or, and whom is gonna be communicating it out, would be to also send it to, the 4 towns, whoever it is at the town offices, whoever is in charge of their own town's Facebook page, for postings, because I know that Starksboro, we have postings every now and again, and maybe that would be another place where we could say, hey, here's another place where you can find, discussions that we've been having.
New Haven still sends out a monthly, well, not electronic, but a newsletter to all the community members as well.
Yeah.
So, are one of you doing tonight's really? Like, so are you the first name on the list that Aaron populates? Or if both of you say you'll do it tonight?
I'll do it. Shot at it.
Great, right?
so I just want to check the action. The action was to fill board highlight assignments. Do we need any clarity that? I think what happened was the board authorized Aaron to develop the assignments.
Yes.
Yes.
That might
After
be
tomorrow,
the-
yeah.
That might be the amendment to the motion.
Yeah.
Kristen.
Yeah, all right, so I move to, and you might have to walk me through it, to amend my motion to reflect that Aaron will be assigning each of us to specific dates for capturing the board highlights. Beautiful, that work?
Can I have a second?
A second.
Steve? All those in favor of the amended motion for filling board highlights, assigning me to fill that? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm opposed.
Confusion.
Brad is opposed.
Process.
So that,
Then that's the amended motion.
that just amended it, yeah.
Right, and then we need to go back to the original motion. So. All those in favor of. The original motion filling board highlights assignment. Say aye.
I think a little
No. Oh,
different,
wait, oh,
so,
what?
so that just approved the amendment.
Right,
So you now have an amended motion,
oh, now. we
which
can vote
is
on that
to
motion.
authorize Aaron as chair to assign the board highlights or however it was just.
Fill the
raised.
board.
Fill the
Fill
board
the board
assignments, right.
highlights. All those in favor of that?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm opposed.
Any abstentions? Okay. Phew. Okay. Next on the agenda is an action item of setting a budget target for a budget revote.
So you probably heard our budget didn't pass. And we now have an obligation to put together a revised budget. The $1 million question is, what is the new target that this board wants me to shoot for that we think will pass voter approval? Floyd, do you have, Floyd has some information that we'll send around. What Floyd and I thought might be useful for you in consideration of that, it comes from my belief is the reaction, the no vote was a reaction to the projected tax rate change. That it's higher than what we normally would see. It seems less likely to me that the reaction was to the dollar amount that was on the ballot, because out of context, that number doesn't mean much to anybody. But with the news coverage about the, looking at 20% increases in the state, et cetera. And then our own projections that went out in the budget flyer showing, essentially a 13 to 16% increase in the tax rate. We're operating under the assumption that that was really what landed people in a place of saying no to the budget. So what's coming around to you now is a spreadsheet that shows how much expenditure reductions we need to be looking at to reduce the tax rate by various amounts. So to reduce the tax rate by 1%, and when we're talking about the tax rate, we're talking about the post CLA tax rate. Because again, we think that's what people reacted to. Our homestead tax rate, which is the tax rate before CLA, was 3%. Looking back over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been anywhere from like 1 to 3% is sort of in the range of where we've been. So that wasn't necessarily a real outlier, but it was the post CLA tax rate that was an outlier. That 15%-ish range is higher than what we have been looking at, where we have in the past several years, we've been, in the 4 to 8% range is what has passed in recent years. So a 1% drop requires about $227,000 in reduction in spending. So what you have is a 1% drop. If you wanted to reduce by 6% to get under that 10% threshold, if we felt like that was sort of a marker to hit to get a yes. Or if we went all the way to no tax rate increase post CLA. So try to give you a few benchmarks. You don't have to pick one of these, of course, it can be anywhere in between any of these, but just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. I will offer that up to about 500,000 in savings. I think we can manage with a relatively little pain. When we start getting in excess of that amount, there are going to be implications. And how much over that will drive what those implications are.
What are the other school districts doing that? Got voted down.
Exactly what we are trying to figure out what that number is. I haven't heard
Apparently.
enough to know if there's a pattern developing in terms of the amount of money that people are reducing. And the amount of money is not necessarily all that telling, because a really big school budget cutting $1 million and us cutting $1 million are very different scenarios, so.
I wonder, would it be worth taking the time to talk about what would it look like for the schools under each of these categories? What would those cuts imply?
So you mentioned time, it might be worth talking about a preferred timeline as well, which has an impact on what you just described. We have to, by contract, issue commitments to employ professional staff by April 1st. If we don't have a passed budget, I have to over issue RIF notifications to make sure that we're not making commitments to employ people that we can't afford because we don't have a budget yet. The impact on an organization to over issue essentially pink slips to people is significant. My interest is to have a budget vote happen in March. At least to give our best effort to have a budget that we know passed, so that I can issue contracts with confidence and only have to issue the RIFs that I know are necessary. So that has implications, so because we're on the topic, I'll send this document around. This is just a little calendar of a timeline to be able to achieve that. So March 26th would be the target date for a revote. Because we're talking about a budget revote, the timeline for all the warnings and everything is very different. There's statutory language that allows for an expedited process. So you have to hold, you can warn a vote, and you would have the informational session at least 5 days later, and you can hold the actual vote 7 days later. So you could warn a vote on a Tuesday and the following Tuesday vote on that budget. It does have to be by Australian ballot, and it has to be at the same polling location that the last vote was held, unless one of those locations is not available, and then they can change the location. But basically, it's a 1 week window from posting to vote, as opposed to the not less than 30, not more than 40 days for the initial vote. And so this, to achieve that, you can see what this timeline shows, that we would set a target tonight. I would bring to you a budget that hits the target on the 18th. We would warn that, you would approve the warning and the ballot, just like you do otherwise. We would post that on the 19th. And then Monday, the 25th would be the informational meeting, and Tuesday, the 26th would be the revote. And then I just included the April timeline just to see that April 1st is when those contracts have to be issued by. There is a chance, if we can't hit the 26th, or if the 26th happens and it fails and we need to go back to the drawing board, I could have a conversation with the union to enter into a side agreement to extend the April 1st deadline for issuing contracts. That's also unsettling to staff to not have that commitment. So that has implications as well, but it is something that we could pursue. They'd have to agree to it. And they may or may not, but we could explore that.
I'm sorry, can I get the timeline? You said 3/19 or 3/18? I don't see it. 19.
Yes, Steve.
So if it just continues to fail. I forget what statute says, we have the authority to borrow up to like 85% of last year's budget.
So I
Keep
think
running until we do get it passed.
you can borrow up to that much because you don't have the authority yet for an approved budget. But you would begin operating on the assumption that you use the prior year's budget. So that's the year we're in. we're in that funny time of year where we're talking about next year, but we're still in this year, so last year is this year. So we would operate FY 25 with FY 24 dollars with the ability to borrow up to 80-something% of FY 24 to have sort of operating cash. That's my understanding of it. So effectively,
We'd be in this.
it'd be a $3 million reduction because FY 25 budget right now is $3 million more than FY 24 budget. $3 million would have an impact.
Well, it wouldn't be the last option that you have on this sheet. That's the flat.
It'd be-
FY24.
it'd be
That's
less.
4 million.
So
That
the,
last option is a flat tax, not flat spending.
Okay,
it's a
So
reduction in
a
spending.
reduction of $1 million in spending over this year gives us a flat tax.
I see, all right. So just continuing this budget on with no change would be somewhere between the third and fourth option.
Correct.
Right. Closer to the fourth than the third, but between the
Right.
two, yeah.
And so just so I'm understanding, when you say you have to, you're talking about employment contracts,
Mhm.
it does that, am I understanding it? So that's where the cuts would be made.
Right.
Okay.
So, right, so by April 1st, ideally, we would know by April 1st what our budget is. And I would know what positions we can afford and can't afford, and I would issue those RIF notifications to the people whose positions are not in the budget going forward. When we don't have a passed budget by that time, I have to issue enough RIF notices to basically cover, I guess, any budget that ends up passing.
Well, you'd have to send out the RIF notices to get you to that. In
To
between
level spending,
level
right?
spending,
$3 million worth of
right?
reductions.
Floyd, what was between the time that we voted last year and when the yield came out? I remember there was a significant improvement in the yield.
The yield improved, but I don't think it, I'm not entirely positive, but I think it was at the end of the legislative session
Yeah,
that they set that, so it was end of April, May.
but do you remember what the level of
change
improvement
was?
was?
No, I can tell you in a couple minutes.
I just have a sneaky suspicion we're gonna run the same thing here.
Mhm.
I mean, the real estate values are skyrocketing, but I imagine it sounds to me because we haven't hit this before. At this level, that the values are rising faster than the expenses. And somehow the yield isn't doing its job and keeping. Yeah, it's not being, the base homestead rate is not being adjusted enough to counter that. And I'm wondering if they're
It
gonna,
certainly won't catch. I mean, that base rate, that yield, the CLA has been set, right?
yeah,
So that's not going, and that would be the larger driver.
but that's
More
still
likely
going to
the
give you a
larger
certain
driver.
amount of money.
Mhm.
And once they understand what that money is, then they set the yield, the
The
final
yield
yield,
base.
right?
Right, so they set what the assessed value of property across the state is. What they don't know is spending and revenue. To set the
don't.
yield for the ed fund.
Right,
That's
Right.
the flux, not the value of the property. So you're not gonna see a change in your CLA. But your yield could move.
yeah, your base,
Will move.
the base homestead rate could move based on what the yield does.
Right.
And the yield that we are using was informed by a survey that they put out asking districts, what do you think your spending is gonna be this year? Like, what are the budgets you're bringing forward?
Yeah,
What it doesn't account for are the 30 budgets that failed that people are doing exactly what we're doing, and they're gonna go back and they're gonna reduce spending by some amount. And that likely would have a positive impact on the yield, but they don't have information enough now to even give an estimate of what that change would be.
well, the yield must have stayed pretty high then. Or must have, it's I know it's backwards, like when it's low, it's. It's high, I can't remember which way it goes, but,
Low yield is bad, high yield is good.
right, so it must not, for us to see this double-digit increase this year over all the other years where, the real estate, I mean, the real estate values haven't been rising just this year.
Recognize that what's driving the yield is spending. And what's happened across the state with the Act 127 is some of the advantaged districts have been able to spend substantially more with no tax impact.
Mhm.
That money has to come from somewhere.
All right, so that's the balloon that's driving,
That's the balloon,
that's the backdoor thing that's keeping the yield low.
because the less advantaged districts that the weighting study was designed to advantage,
Mhm.
to give them more spending capacity on the same tax dollar, is what creates, to your point, a balloon that a disadvantaged district gets a bigger hit on. And the CLA is all part of,
Yeah, the CLA has been the CLA forever. I mean, that equation has always been riding along with the real estate
Sure.
market. It's just, why is suddenly spending now supporting a double digit, penalty off the CLA versus.
It is a
what we normally
combination.
see off the CLA.
It's a perfect storm almost. You have somewhat unprecedented increases in spending because everything is increasing in cost so much, so rapidly. And you have the CLAs at near record lows or record lows. And you have the adjustments of 127 that Floyd talked about all coming together
Yeah.
to create the kind of impact that we're seeing.
Sorry, Liz has had her hand up.
Oh, I was, one, sorry, yeah, no, it's good, the yield, we can. Or our neighbors are counting on. The number that's sticking in my head is the 500,000, right, that you said you could pretty much do without feeling it. And then, or without like a huge impact. Our neighbors are counting on lowering their percentage. And they're counting on the yield raising. So that to add to their positive impact of reducing their spending. And so that's a part of that it wouldn't just be, because that would put us at just over 2% drop to get us
Mhm.
to about 500,000. And then they're counting on a couple of percent, my understanding, I don't want to misrepresent what their choices were. But they said they were also counting on a couple of percentages from the yield. And the approach sounded to me like to do something that was tenable and then and they also asked for if this were to not pass, what might those impacts look like? And had a good conversation to Barb's point of, or are looking to have a good conversation of, what's required be offered by a school district to their students and what are the unrequired, not legally required programs and services. And to kind of get a sense of what those things are.
The challenge, I'm certainly happy to put together any information that the board is interested in. The challenge with, for example, showing you the what ifs for each of these and what the impact would be. I have what I believe is sort of a moral obligation to inform anybody that would be impacted by this what if that we're playing. And so I would have to, in this extreme example where we go back to, if we look at option 4, where we reduce current spending by $1 million, that's $4 million. I would have to, as I'm fleshing this out, I don't want somebody to hear because they listened to a board meeting that there was any scenario where their job might be on the line, and that's the first they're hearing of it. I would want to have conversations with the people impacted by $4 million in reductions. That's a lot of people I'd be talking with, saying your job might be on the line, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from the board. Going into playing out a scenario that may not be very likely. So I'd like to keep the options that you want me to explore and bring back to you pretty limited because of the impact it can have on the morale in the buildings, which is already challenged. Like I've heard people already express concern because they were more recently hired and they know the budget failed and they know we're having this conversation. I prefer to not add to that angst any more than is necessary.
So I'm thinking about optics right now and passing the budget. I think the conversation we just had about the yield is extremely complicated and hard to understand. Your presentation is beautiful. I don't believe that it was viewed as much as it should have been viewed. I'm just gonna put that out there and not, fault of anybody.
No worries at all. I'm
However-
totally with you.
So I wonder is there a way to change the perception that we are spending all the money when in reality, it's a very complicated mix of events, the perfect storm, so that our constituents can be more supportive. And really maybe explain if indeed we want to if we want to explain where the increases are, how important they are to our students. Because I think that's the bottom line, the students. And I think before, like, I really think we should have a, and I'm not saying no, this timeline is off, but I really think that we need to talk to people and make sure that we're just not sending the same crowd out with the same mentality to vote down another budget.
Actually, so just had it's all over the news that a third of the school budgets in Pennsylvania, it's like frontline everywhere. So I haven't been following what the state, is the state following up in any way? Like, this is kind of a landslide. And because of this complication of how the money is allocated and funded, are they talking about doing anything to help?
Yes, there's a lot of talk. So tomorrow marks my third interview in the last week with news outlets. I'm offering testimony to the House Ed and House Ways and Means on Thursday, as are multiple other superintendents. There is a lot of buzz at the state recognizing likely substantial change in the state and how we organize ourselves needs to be considered. Part of what's not even addressed here, but is informing that conversation, is this facility, the statewide facilities assessment that was just done, which shows buildings need somewhere in the billions of dollars in investment. That's forthcoming expenses. That isn't what's driving this budget right now necessarily. So all of those things, again, another kind of perfect storm to say, what's the response at the state level? The last time there was I'll say similar, but it was half the percentage of the budgets that failed. The following session, I think, is when Act 46 passed. So there is precedent that when there is this sort of pretty significant reaction statewide to the cost of education by failed budgets, that there's some systemic response at the state level. So, but again, the way that process materializes necessarily, so it starts with a bit of a buzz, probably leads to some sort of committee formation that charges some sort of a study, that the study comes back, which then informs legislation. So it's a multi-year process before anything really substantive comes about from that. And in the meantime, we've got to navigate the situation we're in right now.
So my gut reaction to this is that we have to get below double digits. That's my 2 cents. I mean, if somebody thinks that most of the people can't digest this conversation, they really have to struggle with it. But they can see that last number. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And if it looks like they're doing anything about it, I think it's gotta be at least a 4 or 5% move to the needle. Or anybody's going to feel like we've made an effort.
Yep. And I don't disagree with that. Where the challenge comes with that, so there's a philosophical piece for me in this, beyond the numbers, and that is, I'm not a huge fan of our approach to improving outcomes for students being less of the same thing we've been doing is our path to get there. If we're going to be talking about something in the neighborhood of $1.5 million in reductions, I'd like to have board support in exploring doing things differently with less in pursuit of improved outcomes. Because for me, regardless of the financial challenge or any other challenge we might be facing, our job is still to pursue improved outcomes. A pursuit of hopefully maintaining status quo doesn't appeal to me. I think our students need better than that. Our community needs better than that. And we're kind of caught in this rock and hard place situation where our community has demonstrated that there's not a lot of appetite for any real significant change to do that. So I don't know how that push-pull works, but I think that's the reality we find ourselves in. Because I absolutely can reduce spending by 1.5 million and do less of the same stuff we've been doing. Absolutely achievable. That's not going to do great things for kids. And it's going to put more stress on the individuals that are left in the organization to try and stretch and cover the things that we've cut. I'd rather take a look at doing things differently to reduce what would otherwise be this added burden to everyone that's left in the organization. Find those savings and feel like we at least have a chance at doing something better for kids in the end still.
I think that speaks to Barb's point earlier. You know, what does 1.5 million look like? Maybe. And you know, I understand your point about wanting to get ahead of the rumor mill with folks who might have who this might impact. But I think we also, at the end of the day, need to know kind of what we're gonna be left with, if making that decision.
How long would it take you, Patrick, to look at those alternatives?
I may have already started in anticipation of a conversation about where we go with this, so. And I knew the kind of aggressive timeline I was going to be presenting, so I could bring to you at least mostly fleshed out. There are always going to be moving parts, but I could bring a $1.5 million option that is the same we're doing now, but less. And I could bring you a $1.5 million option that is perhaps radically different depending on one's perspective.
With the same level of outcome.
Potentially improved outcome.
So
Same level of dollar savings.
So to coin your term, the visual here is sort of a real wake-up call. Then why didn't that come first? Why did we, and I can hear this in my town meeting. Why didn't that happen first before you came to us with this level of funding that we cannot absorb?
I can definitely answer that, but because we made it very clear that we wanted to maintain all of our schools and everything as it is. So we made that clear. So as a board, I felt it was important that I felt strong. I felt supportive of it because it brought forward what we're currently doing and what the cost of that is. And I think it's really important for our community to absorb that this is the cost of doing it as we are. I think that's huge.
But what I'm hearing, what I thought I heard Patrick say was, we can do as well as what we're doing, if not better,
We
for $1.5
can.
million less. So
And
I guess I
therefore-
need to know what that $1.5 million less would be and how it is that we didn't present that first.
Because when such presentations were made in 2020 and other times, it didn't get met with, oh, okay, so this is a way that we can reduce our spending. Like, okay, like, this is a relief. We're getting a plan of 7 different options and all the community input and all these different things that we could do where it would reduce our financial burden. And still get great outcomes, right? And still offer the services, still offer the programs.
So we're talking consolidation, pure and simple. Is that what you're saying, Patrick, I guess?
No, I'm sure that's not what he's saying, but that's.
I'm not bringing up consolidation in any time.
Okay, so then thank you.
You know
What
what
I
I
want to
mean.
get back to my point is, what is the difference between the budget we just took to taxpayers and had it thrown back at us and cutting $1.5 million, and why wasn't that done before we put that budget out there? That's what I'm gonna hear at town meeting.
It's exactly what Liz just shared.
So you're not talking about consolidation.
Nope.
So
But our community said, and actually this board made a commitment to our community, we will not change the structure of any of our schools without a vote of the community. And our communities have said, we don't want to change the structure of our schools. So that option was not brought forward.
so where's the
So the
million?
option of doing the million, that's what I would show. So one option of the $1.5 million is same structure. And we cut from that and we do less of essentially the same thing we're doing now, which I would say is not a path toward improved outcomes for students. I can bring you that option. The other option is we look significantly different and save the money and have what I would perceive to be a better chance of improving outcomes for students.
So significantly different, what does that look like is what I'm asking.
That's what I would need to bring to you.
That would be at a later meeting,
So a different
that option.
But those are the 2 options I would bring. Same structure, saving $1.5 million. Different structure, saving $1.5 million.
Yeah, I think Kathy's point is just that the question probably could still be asked. Why didn't we explore that in November? And yeah, personally, I'm willing to wait till I hear what it is before I make that, before that bell goes off in my head, but I could certainly see people question that.
Mhm.
Um,
And for the record, I brought forward a presentation or a proposal that saved $2.5 million a year. In 2020. That required pretty significant change that. Went less than nowhere. I don't know what that would be, but it definitely went less than nowhere.
It's just a general question, Patrick, in terms of long-term strategy, right? Which is to say that we have this immediate crisis of a budget that we have to address. I fully understand that. But it doesn't seem likely that it's gonna go away next year, or the year after that, or the year after that. And obviously, there's lots of moving parts and lots of unknowns. But I just maybe would love to hear your thoughts on the value of sort of, I don't know, hastily might be an unfair characterization, or maybe it's right on. Like hastily restructuring a lot this year, as opposed to trying to maintain whatever we have this year, so that we can spend the next year asking like,
Yep.
what are the big shifts that we have to do for sustainability in the long term?
That is exactly a thought I have as well, and thinking about. What's the short-term change we have to make to get a budget to pass? And knowing this isn't the last challenging budget. Buying some time to have the longer conversations about the bigger structural changes. And we have. It has implications, but through a combination of savings and the potential use of the Education Reserve Fund. We can buy down effectively this tax rate. The use of the Ed Reserve Fund to buy down the tax rate creates a revenue that we can't sustain, and that feels like a lost revenue in the future.
Like the fund
So we have to be in mind, exactly, just like the fund balance. The only difference is we didn't have any fund balance to use for the FY 25 budget. We expect we'll have a pretty substantial fund balance at the end of FY 24 because of the number of positions we couldn't fill. We ended up not purchasing central office, so we had money set aside just in case that happened, so we could pull that off. The likelihood of being able to gear up contractors and everything for this summer at this point in time is slim, so that's gonna add to this fund balance. So we will probably have a fund balance that we can use to make up for this revenue that we would be manufacturing essentially, if we decided to use the ed fund. So if the board's open to the idea of the use of the ed fund, I can incorporate that into the information I bring back to you about how much I think maybe we should think about using from that.
One question about next year. These percentages are high because they're climbing up onto a new level. The perfect storm is created this wave. Unfortunately, this wave is a plateau. You're gonna get up on it, but one sort of optical benefit to that is that we shouldn't see double-digit increases theoretically due to the same reasons.
Right.
Next year, we'll already be at that level.
You're at that level already.
We're at that level already, so we're not gonna see a 14% increase over. In the next budget cycle.
Yeah.
It should theoretically, I think the state must have been anticipating this bump in the road with 127. Which is why they were throwing out the transition mechanism.
Right, yeah.
But it's just not a big enough transition mechanism.
But-
For a third of the state.
Our
So
bubble drop.
I think it's just important to keep in mind that we theoretically won't see the same level of increase between the next two budgets.
Except for that, our high school students are weighted more heavily, and the drop in enrollment that we had is now reaching the high school. So we also have that big dip that's gonna come that isn't because of the state at all. So that's still on our horizon.
True. Yeah, it's not like there aren't other things that are gonna happen, but for the reasons that we were seeing this year.
I'm just thinking about how much this impacts, like, everybody and everything. And I know you've created this subcommittee of staff and teachers. Can't remember the name of it.
The advisory council.
Thank you. And how often do you bring some of these bigger concept issues to that group that are hands and feet on the ground, working in the schools and helping them come up and brainstorm ideas, and then you get that buy-in for, we gotta make some changes, this is the reality. And rather than like a top-down approach, like, does that come up in your conversations with?
Yeah, so that group is relatively newly formed, and the focus so far has been on revising the strategic plan. So that's really where the work has been. And of course, the budget failing is also brand new, so the opportunity hasn't been there. The challenge there, I think there's a line that we have to walk when we engage staff in talking about where reductions come from.
Mhm.
And the sort of, for lack of a better term, the infighting that can create, and people saying, well, I think you should cut over there, or you should cut over there. Like, everybody will have their perspective of what should get cut. And that's a pretty tricky place to put people in. So I'm always really cautious about asking for that kind of input.
I guess
And
I'm
frankly, that's
thinking-
already happening a little bit anyway, and that's already creating challenges. So
I
just
guess
don't
I'm
want
thinking
feedback.
less about cuts and more about the creativity.
Right,
And what kind of options they might envision or see on the ground that could benefit.
Yep.
And
Yeah,
I
but
understand the
you-
time frame is wonky.
yeah.
Yeah, for
Tricky here,
instance,
but-
let's say you brought this new reorganization option next time. What kind of organizational buy-in would you be looking for or have had already by the time we see this?
Limited opportunity.
Yeah,
Um,
but would you want to then run it around, say, even after we sort of gave it the thumbs up?
yeah, and
Then might that modify?
there's the design and implementation gap as well, right?
Mhm.
So it's one thing to sort of put an idea to paper. Operationalizing that is very nuanced and iterative. Which would involve lots of people. But I think that comes back to Mike's point a little bit in terms of thinking short-term and long-term, and not like a really big change to try and make that happen for the start of next school year would be a challenge, we'll say.
Well, I think that would weigh a lot on my mind I'm looking at these two options. Having a week to come up with a reorganization plan that you can execute with fidelity versus saying, okay, we know we gotta live with less of what we're doing right now for the short term. One seems like a safer bet than the other.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, in terms of the short-term approach, long-term approach. I think if we could make a change. Through some combination that experienced the pain that's closer to the $500,000 impact. But get to the dollars and cents that we needed to get a budget to pass. To buy the time to engage more fully in a bigger picture idea and thinking about how we organize ourselves. That would be, I think, the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Getting to 1.5 million without feeling it. Seems like an unlikely scenario. That would end up having to be something less than 1.5 probably in that case.
And if it doesn't pass, then
we do it again.
Yeah.
Which one? That's what we're trying to hone in on. So I think
Sounds like it
Patrick's
might be
looking
between
for,
2 and 3.
yeah. Oh, do you want just, is that the reduction target okay, or do you want the number? The big spending number?
I'm okay with I mean, I want to acknowledge there's $1.25 million of wiggle room between 2 and 3. That's a big number. But I think I hear the sentiment being we need to get as close as we can to 6 without feeling a tremendous amount of pain.
Well, I'm looking at the very last column.
Yeah.
For what?
Closest we can get to 9.99.
Right. Which is essentially 6. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
little bit more room there, but.
So my concern is that, while we're talking about a 9% increase, we're still looking at folks that at best in 2025 may get a 2.4% cost of living increase. And that doesn't cover what the right-hand column is going to force them to pay.
Yep.
And that's what we need to be very cognizant of. And I think that to push this timeline through would look like that we didn't give that enough consideration, especially if we push this timeline through with anything between the pink and the green options is going to look incredibly disrespectful to the people who were very clear with us that they cannot afford these raises. And I want to be super respectful of that.
Yep.
So, a 2.4% increase in cost of living increase for 2025 would be looking at a budget of 33,728,512.
Say that again.
33,728,512. If you want to increase that to an even 3% over fiscal year, and Floyd, you can probably double check my math faster. You look at it at a straight 3% increase over the fiscal year 24, and you're looking at 33,926,140.
My initial thought there is, I appreciate that perspective, Kathy, that it's not like the budget was universally voted. Right, so it lost by a couple hundred
200.
votes, which is an important message from the community. But you swing the pendulum all the way to that level would at the same time seem to ignore the 1,000 or so voters.
I agree.
Who already approved this,
Yeah.
so I'm a little wary of that level of cuts, though I think the idea that we do need to make a real good faith effort. And what that number is, I'm not exactly sure. But I guess I was worried by hearing a number that low.
Right, but I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
I do think though, there's gotta be a much happier meeting than just looking at a 1% drop or a 6%. We've got to look at this much more constructively than to just pick a timeline and a number off a page. And I don't have enough information to do that for sure. So, and I do worry about our students. You know, they're coming out of a crisis period. They're still in a crisis. There's no getting around that. And the teachers are stressed beyond belief. I mean, I heard that today firsthand. The reality of it is, though, part of that stress starts at home from families that can't afford. And where do we strike that happy medium? And maybe it comes in with different things that Patrick has to offer. I haven't heard any of those. I don't know about them. And I can't see us doing this by April 1st. I really can't, and paying really close attention to who's being affected by what and how.
I think it's important to always hold in your discussions that 60% of our community pays based on income. So this increase, while not irrelevant, isn't anywhere near as impactful as it is to the other 39% of our community.
So are you talking about the district as a whole, Floyd? 60% of our district
Say
is,
that again?
so you're saying that 60% of our district is at a rate where they're going to be paying a lower rate because of their income? Is that what you're saying?
The statistics across the state are 60% of the communities of our community taxpayers pay based on income, not on the property value. So this whole computation is really that total number. Not to discount it, it's 40% of our community, not 100% of our community. So I think that there's an important distinction to be made there, that when we're talking about a large cut that is going to be impactful to the program served, 60% of our community, our neighbors, aren't going to recognize the savings that would generate, one, and two, will lose out on the services that those dollars generate. It's just a nuance within the tax law that it's not, we're not dealing with absolutes. We're dealing with a very large sliding scale that has clearly been structured to ease the tax burden from a property standpoint of our local disadvantaged taxpayers.
So do we have that data? So I think that's incredible information to be able to provide.
So we normally
it-
get one slide in the budget presentation that says, here's the median income for the income-based folks, and here's what that tax impact is on them. I'd be curious to see that same number for these.
Slide with these numbers.
Because I know you're providing it for the normal budget.
And that, my recollection was that was about an 18% increase. So it's,
It wasn't, it was way beyond what we normally see on those folks.
Yep.
I mean, it was like $300 or $400
mhm.
a person, per household.
Yep.
Which
But my point with that was from a percent increase standpoint, though again, it's a different dollar amount, but percent increase, it was comparable, if not a little higher than what we were seeing for the others.
Right.
But it's not at $1,000 for a $300,000 home. It was
$400 increase on it with an 18%, right, something like that, yeah.
Right. But that's a $400 increase on the folks I think Kathy's really concerned about.
Exactly, right.
I don't mean to discount that at
Yeah.
all.
Right,
I just think that piece needs to be layered in the
Yep,
conversation.
agreed.
This is a hard discussion to have, and it's one I kind of wish we'd had months ago.
And to your question, Aaron, in terms, I can live with a range. I think a range of 1% drop in the tax rate to 6% drop in the tax rate is too big a range. If we could narrow that some, that would be really helpful for me.
I'm also looking at the increase before state of Vermont CLA. And I do think it's valuable to think about that number of positive 2.21 to negative 2.2. I think that matters for us, even though it's not the final number. So
And for what it's worth, just gotta pull it up here. I pulled some information from the last few years, so over the last few years, the homestead tax rate, that's before CLAs, that's in the, you can see percent increase before. In FY 20, that was a 1.94% increase in the budget passed. In FY 21, it was a 2.49% increase in the budget passed. In FY 22, it was 1.17. FY 23, there was a big jump in the yield, if you remember, so there was actually a 12% decrease in the homestead tax rate. And in the current year, there was a 0.6% decrease in the homestead tax rate. And the budget, as was warned and voted down, was a 3.1% increase. So as we talked about before, the homestead tax rate increase, which is where we have more control over in terms of the cost per pupil and the yield driving that number, is a little higher, but about 0.6% higher than a year that passed. So much of the inflationary factors are after the homestead tax rate, which we have no control over, which is CLA. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, it's 15%, and that's what people are paying, and that's real. So it doesn't change that narrative. But in terms of what the board or the district's responsibility is to that 15%, it certainly is a factor.
Sorry, I feel over. I like the verbiage of the 0%, which is what our neighbors. Also think it sounds really, so 0%, so 0% increase
On the homestead tax rate, is that what you're saying?
on the increase before state of Vermont CLA.
Okay.
So that hits us somewhere around 3%, is it? 3.5. Sounds really good.
Nice and round. What do other people think?
I mean, that would be a way to narrow down your range, if that was sort of the top end in the option. The green 6% was sort of the bottom end of the range, at least for the first set of proposals. So it's sort of between these two. You know, the only comment that I'll have there is, like, I agree that, like, when we talk about it, that seems right, but I don't know if each level matters. Like, for example, our per pupil spending was actually decreased from last year. So that's one step before this CLA, right? And now we're gonna try and say CLA is at 0. But each of those steps ultimately don't matter, I think, until the end. And so I'm sort of realizing, like, at least my sense now is, like, doesn't matter what we say about, like, we're spending less per pupil, the CLA is the same, like, all of that aside, the number will still the end.
Cost is fixed. At the end.
Right, and
Yeah.
so, like, I think it's fine as a good benchmark, but I don't even know if it's gonna move. Although maybe that just shows in a week I've become very pessimistic. So I hope that's not the case. I'm usually eternally optimistic, but there's part of me that,
It's also part of the reality, though.
Yeah.
It's not being pessimistic, but just numbers aren't gonna look pretty anyway, we slice them up.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about that? Is that range still too big, or do we feel like?
Well, so I think what I heard Liz say was a 0% increase on the homestead tax rate. So that is in the sheet that's in front of you, that's the percent increase before state of Vermont CLA.
The green column.
The green column, that at 0%. In the end, you know, just so that's almost exactly right in the middle between the option 2 and option 3. And so presumably that's going to result in somewhere around a 12.5-ish% increase on the tax rate instead of closer to 16, which is what we're at now.
I think again, it comes back to, how does this impact the students? How does it impact our staff?
I think that's important to share because when people are voting, not necessarily all looking at the tax and looking at that number. So what does that number mean?
Yeah, I mean, even if we were trying to do this exercise, let's just say the waiting study had really nailed us and we decided we were going to have to cut back in November, I'm sure people would want to know what we were doing operationally to make those cuts happen.
Mhm.
So where do we go from here? I guess is my question. I haven't been through a full budget process here. So if we were sending you back to come up with numbers and the outcomes, what's gonna happen to the outcomes, what's gonna happen to the students and staff? We don't have another meeting. We did 26th, right? So would we look at this on the 26th?
Well, that's part of the conversation. And again, we can do whatever we need to do. But if we don't have a budget passed by the time I have to issue contracts, I have to assume a worst case scenario, whatever that looks like.
Mhm.
And I have to issue RIF notifications to accommodate that worst case scenario. That will be a lot of RIF notifications.
So you're proposing a meeting on that 18th, yes? It's
Yeah, I mean, I'm proposing for those reasons, because I understand the implications of telling dozens of people they don't have a job next year. In a time when everybody has vacancies, like that people understandably will look for other employment that when they otherwise wouldn't have been looking for other employment, and they will likely get other employment because we have great people. And then we will be left with vacancies that we likely can't fill.
But they
So
won't be
even if
looking in the 29 other towns that they'll.
Right. Unless they happen to pass a budget before we do, because they went with a more expedited. I think you listened to the meeting last night. I did not. Addison Northwest, I think right now is targeting March 26th.
Absolutely.
So even that, Middlebury's passed. If Virgin's passes on March 26th and we're sometime mid-April.
Answer the question on a flat pre-CLA tax rate. It's 12.4% in Bristol, which is the highest.
Yeah, that was my guess, just from looking at the halfway between the 9.8 and the 14.8.
maybe I'll just ask Patrick one more question for you, which is, I don't want to overburden like the request for you all, but given that we don't have a sense of what's on the options for how you get to this number, is it reasonable for you to give us, much almost like you've done here, at least a couple of options so we can sort of get a sense of the severity of what we're giving up to get to the tax rate?
Yep.
And I wouldn't want you to do even necessarily 4 of those, but if we had a couple of those, even in terms of our messaging back to the community, it would show sort of due diligence of like, look, if we end up coming back and saying 12.4 is the increase.
Yeah.
We could say, and the reason is, we also looked at a budget that was less than 10%. And this is what realistically would have to go.
Yeah, the concern isn't so much the workload for me. The concern is exclusively the number of people I have to tell may potentially not have a job next year. And that's the only piece, like in terms of playing out scenarios, I want to make sure that we're only playing out what could actually be viable scenarios. So I'm not putting people through the ringer unnecessarily, so.
Yeah, that's why I think we should maybe have like a minimum cut that we'd like to see and maybe a maximum.
We don't know what that is until we know.
Well, that's the problem. So that's,
Yeah.
I don't know what to bring you until you give me some numbers to shoot for, and you don't know what numbers you give me until I tell you what to expect for impact. All I can tell you is the more money we cut, the greater the impact. And I think it's inappropriate for me to tell you as a board what percentage is the right percentage to bring to the community. I think it's appropriate for you as a board to tell me, this is the number we think is going to get a yes from our community. Bring us a budget that hits that number. And I'm okay with the range but I think it's inappropriate for me as superintendent to drive that. I think you as a board need to drive it.
Well, I have to say that I'm still in favor of getting it below 10%. I think that's the kind of effort that I think people are looking for.
So that would be around the 6% mark.
with as many nines after the decimal point. as I can-
Sometimes you can find, yeah. That's just me, though.
Yeah, could you look at a
Throwing
3 to
that-
6% range,
What's that? 3 to 6?
like 3 to 6%?
Yeah, I mean, I could bring you, probably that 3% is. Well,
That's what
be
Liz is.
3.5% is pretty close. Yeah, it's
We
sort
have
of,
two, we have
basically
Liz's
Liz
proposal
is-
and we have the
Yeah.
under 10%, like those are clean benchmarks.
Yeah.
Yep.
Of two places we could at least start.
and that's basically a 12.5% increase on the tax rate and a 9.9999999% increase on the tax rate.
All of it.
And then, to Kathy's point, and then recognizing that this is not the end of the
Yeah,
story.
that's the-
That is still
Right.
too much, and we have some really big conversations to engage in the near.
And having to go through this process as a voter, having to go through it, you're seeing what my taxes this year. And I think you're gonna find a group that's a whole lot more receptive to other alternatives than they were 2 years ago. Because we just can't sustain, it, and we were all hearing it. And in order for us to get it where it's tolerable for you, this is what we have to do.
I can remember like Nate saying that nobody's going to close a school until they have to close a school.
And we're almost at the point where we have to
And-
close this.
And it has to be painful
Yeah.
before you get to that level.
They will. Remember that.
And I'm not saying we're at that point right now, I'm just saying that he recognized that people are gonna hang on to what they have until they
Till
just
they
can't
can't.
do it anymore.
So I'm looking at the time and we have an executive session still. Are people comfortable with making a motion to set a range between 3% and 6%? For Patrick to bring options back to us.
You, is that between 3% and 6% of,
A reduction in the
Reduction.
post CLA tax rate of 3% and 6%. And I didn't necessarily hear a range, like pick something in the middle of
Right.
that. I heard two options.
3 and 6.
and maybe a couple of versions of each option or something like that, but what would it look like at a 3% reduction in the tax rate post CLA? And a 6% reduction in the tax rate post CLA? Recognizing it could be 2.975 and.
Whatever. So can I get a motion to that effect?
So moved.
I'll second that.
I'm gonna ask you to clarify that because I can't put in a motion to that effect.
Sorry.
I think this, I mean,
Yeah.
I just wanna make sure I get this motion absolutely precise, because this is obviously.
Kathy, do you want to state it? or-
I'll give it a shot. The
Okay.
board instructs the superintendent to present to us on the 18th, is that it? Monday, the 18th. Projected change in education costs or expenditures in this district between the 6% drop below the warned budget, previously warned budget, and 3%, is that what we did? 3% below the previously warned budget. With the impacts on outcomes, staffing and taxes included. Did I catch that? Does that give you enough to go on, Patrick?
You had me at 3%, 6%.
You're cheating. Is that,
Can I just put it back to the captain?
sure,
The board instructed the superintendent to present to the board on March 18th, projected changes in education expenditures of 6% below the previously warned budget and 3% previously warned budget, with the impact on outcome, staffing, and taxes.
The only clarity I would make on that, we're not talking about a 3% reduction in the expenditures or a 6% reduction in the expenditures. We're talking about a 3% reduction in the tax
Tax
rate
rate.
post CLA
correct.
and a 6% reduction in the tax rate post CLA.
Thank you, Beth. Does that help?
6% change in the tax rate post CLA.
Yep.
Thank you.
So Kathy made that motion. Barbara, are you seconding that motion still?
Yes.
All those in favor, or is there any other discussion about that?
Yeah, I'd like to have it read one more time.
Yes.
I think Brad.
The board instructed the superintendent to present to the board on March 18th. Projected. See it again. Projected change in education expenditures at 6% in the, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I started there in. So what I have, the board instructed the superintendent to present to the board on March 18th. But you've got it.
Really a budget that reflects, and maybe it's easier to speak to what the resulting tax rate will be as opposed to the reduction in the tax rate. Bring us a budget that has a 12.5% increase in the post CLA tax rate, budget that has
Under,
an under 10%.
Did you say that again?
so
So
instead of talking about the expenditure, we're talking about the tax rate change.
that's really what the
Post
conversation was.
CLA.
A 12.5% increase option and a 9.9% increase option.
Where you following it? Yeah.
So 12 and a half. Well, under. 12 and a half will be somewhere in between.
And I will assume if by some miracle we get an updated yield from the state between now and then, that's fair game.
Sure.
I don't think that's gonna happen, but
Hold on, let Vicky get this straight.
The board instructed to present to the board on March 18th a budget that reflects a projected change in education expenditures. Now we're taking it out.
Oh,
So here's what I'd like you to do. You can just dictate it.
Yeah,
The board instructed the superintendent to present to the board on March 18th.
a budget that reflects a post CLA tax increase of not more than 12%. And
less than 10.
less than 10%.
thought it was 12.5.
Yeah.
12 and a half.
It's gonna matter.
Yeah, yeah, I guess.
That's $100,000.
Once and then was it period?
Yes.
Yes. You got back one more time?
The board instructed the superintendent to present to the board on March 18th a budget that reflects a post CLA tax increase of not more than 12.5% and less than 10%.
And includes. What do they say, the changes in staffing, student outcomes.
You can't provide detail on
Yeah, you can,
what affects student outcomes.
you can. If you're gonna be reducing staff off the top, you're gonna know that your student outcomes aren't gonna be where they're at, correct?
For the impact, I think is what we were talking about.
Student, that's a much better.
Impact on student
Impact on
services.
student
Right.
services, there you go.
To say that, what is the impact on student services?
Yeah, impact on student services. I'm a little concerned that
I'm good with that.
saying staffing.
Yeah, we all know what that means.
Yes.
Impact on student services, thank you, that's good, that's great.
And we're not gonna be that
And
specific,
less than
right?
10%.
Well, answer the question.
And the resulting impacts on students.
So, board instructed the superintendent to present to the board on March 18th a budget that reflects a post CLA tax increase of not more than 12.5% and less than 10%, and along with the resulting impact on student services.
And I'm assuming that you'll present the same format here as the estimated change of $100,000 value, right?
Yep, and we can do the impact on the median income for the income
That's
side,
great.
like we have been.
Okay,
Kathy and,
yeah. Any other discussion? All those in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay,
Can I take back my offer to do the,
yeah, he,
to do the notes?
I was so glad you offered though.
I was like thinking, oh, there will be a break. Lively debate ensued.
so
That's right, yes.
for meeting preparation, then are we adding a board meeting to the 18th for this? So, yeah,
Should we pencil in the 25th as well then? Because that would have to be a board meeting, which would be the informational meeting.
18th and 25th. Meeting.
And obviously the 25th doesn't have to happen if the 18th doesn't result in an approved budget and adopted warning and all that, but to have it ready to go in the event that we get there.
And I imagine the 25th wouldn't necessarily have to be the whole board.
It would have to be a quorum of the
It
board.
has to be a quorum.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah, because I won't be able to be there.
Just talking about the budget in terms of, it's not the whole.
It's just an informational meeting on the budget. It's required by law to hold it, and I do believe you have to have a quorum of the board for it to be an official informational meeting. Because our annual meeting acts as the informational meeting. So of course, this is a little different process.
So my other question is, did the legislature pass the funding of a special ballot for this? Or are we gonna have to?
That
I
was part
thought
of
they
it.
did.
Yeah.
right?
I think we did.
is it only for
That's the
votes
piece
that were delayed?
that's what I was wondering. It was,
Oh,
it was around the delay
Yeah.
and the impact of that, but we can see if there's any wiggle room, because it's, I want to say it's about $1,000 per
For
town
town.
for Revo. And that's usually when we're doing the Scantron thing. We don't have time with this schedule to send, like, it'll be a paper ballot like we used to do it, and we'll have to hand count. We won't have the machine to do it because of the time it takes to send the warned ballot or the approved ballot to them and get it back and program the machine. There wouldn't be enough time. So it'll be the old fashioned way on whatever funky color paper we like to use, and people check yes or they check no. And the boards of civil authority will meet presumably at central office or maybe at Bristol and Holly Hall. And they'll literally put all the ballots on a big table and commingle and count.
So, and I have a question about the commingling also. Is that a policy this board set, or is that, I know
It's
it's
in our
not a
articles of
state,
agreement.
it's in our articles of agreement between the towns that commingles.
Yep.
Because it's just so much easier for the other committees if you know where you need to concentrate your efforts and why.
Yep.
And when you don't commingle ballots, it was so much easier before.
Okay.
Can we negotiate a change and
Not
Anything
today.
possible, but not today. Right?
So just be prepared for the 18th and potentially the 25th for additional board meetings. Also, for meeting preparation, we have certain urgency for filling vacant board seats, 2 open seats in Bristol. We had 2 people join us tonight who are interested in these positions. One of them is still with us, Melissa.
yeah.
So we will invite them for our standing business meeting on the 26th. To go over that process. You're welcome to join us for any one of these additional fun meetings if you'd like. So that's upcoming. For future.
18th at 6 again.
I would assume we'd meet at 6. Yep.
And probably the same on the 25th, just to keep it consistent.
So the next is our public comment session. Have any public for public comment?
So I'm like, show my questions.
So if we'd like to do our meeting evaluation, we don't have any actions coming out of here, out of this executive. So we can close out our meeting here. We'll move into executive session, and then the only thing we'll do when we come out is adjourn the meeting.
Would you like to give me the highlights? Anybody?
One question.
Yeah.
You sent out an email earlier about an executive session on a different type of topic.
Yep, Aaron and I chatted, we're thinking maybe the 26th would be good for that, so we'll push that.
Otherwise, we'd have to.
Yep.
Note
Right.
that here.
Okay. Does anyone want to do the board self-evaluation?
I'll start. And then the highlights for Kathy.
Yep.
Um. So we're not doing the new evaluation tool
Right,
yet.
just the Survey Monkey variety.
Okay. Level of engagement of all board members high.
Yes.
Was the agenda followed?
Yes.
Does the chair effectively establish the agenda and board materials for distribution?
Yes.
First meeting.
Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, ensuring the integrity of the board process?
Yeah.
Yes.
Other feedback for the chair?
Thank you.
Great.
Yes.
Great meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Busy of a person.
Yeah, no kidding. It's the only way.
That's how you got on the board, right?
Rip off that Band-Aid,
girl.
Negotiations are easy.
You wait.
And then we have what went well with the meeting, so is this, or,
Yeah, that's where I'm envisioning the highlights.
That's
might
what we should-
generate, but yeah.
Well, I think the budget discussion was probably the main highlight.
it's the big
Set
thing,
set the budget targets.
new member,
New member.
multiple members, multiple new members.
Reorganization went well. Define those.
When I do this, do I have to put in all of the numbers and the charge that we gave you to look at these?
No, no,
Just,
again, you're not trying to
like
duplicate the
headline
minutes, you
generic.
just.
What's the community want to know?
Broad stroke.
Between the agenda and the
Yeah.
minutes.
Couple of sentences to entice someone to read the facts.
Right.
Half a teaser.
Patrick's cowboy boots were just really. That's the focal point. So we're gonna-
No.
And then what's it, are we all set with the highlights?
Thank you. Thank you all.
And what suggestions do we have for ways to improve future meetings?
Food.
Sorry.
Come up a few times.
I haven't had dinner.
Negotiations. Nice job, Erin.
Yeah.
Group effort.
Well,
Okay. So before we conclude the public portion of our meeting, we need to determine that moving into this executive session, giving premature knowledge to the general public would place us in a disadvantage. And we're talking about labor relations and agreements with employees. So first I need a motion that would determine that premature general public knowledge would clearly place the public body or person involved at a substantial disadvantage.
So move, Steve.
Second,
I'll second.
Justin? Any discussion about that? All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Now I need a motion to enter the executive session under T1 VSA 5313 A1B, labor relations agreements with employees.
And invite Patrick and
And
Katrina.
I need to invite Patrick and Katrina to join us. Justin?
I'll second.
Justin? All those in favor of moving into executive, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Abstentions.